they've seen the video. So please.
Yeah.
I would like to start if it's okay.
Yes.
Sure. If you think it's okay.
I think it's okay.
I think it's okay too.
So, yeah, one of the reflections that came up after watching your lecture, Jan, is you were talking about that we should think of disarming, like demilitarizing, and also shifting to trans-armament. And then I was thinking, how can we secure safety without using military, as we have been used to have military as the safety providers for a lot of time? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, particularly psychologically, because we have been told for decades that the military is something that protects us. You know, the mantra of NATO is security, stability, and peace. Whatever they do, it's these three things that count. And taxpayers are paying for the military, of course. That's the way wars are financed. It's taxpayers, whether they want it or not. If governments decide to go to war or intervene or kill, it's done for taxpayers' money. And so the deal seems to be that you pay us, the government and the military, we pay the military, and it protects you, the people. Now, and also it creates peace and security. Now, if you take an organization like NATO, which is humanity's and history's largest military alliance, led by the United States and with the allies in Europe. Now, if that philosophy was right, there would have been peace long, long ago on Earth. You know, we keep on hearing like a perpetuum mobile, like an eternal machine going on and going on and going on, that no matter what we have done, there's some dangers out there, and there's some nasty guys who are getting new weapons, and we need to always, you know, follow up and be as strong. And then there was this idea, historically, I would say before you guys were born, there was the idea of a military balance. There was a whole theory. That's what I learned when I was a student of peace studies and international politics, that if there was a balance between two parties, they were not very likely to attack each other. Because, you know, A would not know that he could win over B if B had almost the same capabilities and motivation as A had. And so that lasted for a long time during basically the old Cold War, which ended in 89-90. And now, obviously, we are very unbalanced because Russia is one country, whereas you have the whole alliance, I think, of 29 countries of NATO, and Russia's military expenditures, which has some relation to how much you can do in a war situation, is 8% of NATO's combined military expenditures. So there's now a gross lack of balance. And I don't know what works in the long run, but what I know is a security politics that first and foremost builds on weapons. And in parentheses, for instance, not on a good health sector that could have helped us when the corona came. If we have a military system that only goes up, 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 up all the time and never has created peace for 70 years, it's time to rethink the whole thing. And that's what a number of peace researchers and I myself call trans-armament. Trans-armament is not the same as disarmament, because disarmament would just be to reduce all the weapons we have down to 10% of what we have. Trans-armament is a different type of way to create security. Trans means transforming the whole security thinking into something new, which is mostly civilian, conflict resolution, early warning, negotiations, all these things. When tension builds up, we should talk with each other instead of threatening each other. And then as last resort, and according to the UN Charter, we can use some kind of military on a much lower level, which is defensive. Everybody today has offensive weapons. The United States have weapons they can reach China and Russia with. Russia has long-range missiles that they can kill hundreds of millions of people in the United States with. Whereas I say, or those who think along these terms, we should have something that can only work if we are attacked. That means short-range weapons, less destructive capacity, no nuclear weapons, because you would not like to use nuclear weapons on your own territory in the name of defense. And then finally, it means only to have weapons which are not threatening anybody else. The reason we have an accumulated upward spiral all the time is that my weapon is a threat in the eyes of the other. So the whole thing is rethink the way we do security, stability, and peace, so that one day we can get rid of it all and say, we're friends. We cooperate instead of threatening each other. And that's what trans-armament is in comparison to more armament or disarmament, because you're right in answering the question, how can we be safe if we disarm all the weapons we've learned give us security? That is not a solution, because psychologically people, the citizens, would not go along with just having no weapons of some kind. What I say is, okay, for those people who want a weapon being a part of national defense, that's fine, but they must be defensive, not offensive. It is no idea that Denmark is going to buy F-35, which can only be used far away to bomb places far away, but cannot be used to protect Jutland or DNS or something like that, you know. Well, all this, of course, is also a way of saying that it would be finally a defense thinking that would be much less taxing, much less a burden to the environment as the present one is. The present one is, as I've described in my video, very, very hard on the environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's a whole new way of thinking. That's what I'm trying to say. You cannot change a bad thing by just doing less of it. You have to change from doing the wrong thing to doing the good thing, the right thing. You can never solve a problem by just doing a little less of that problem. That's why disarmament is okay if you can get rid of some weapons, better than not. But that's not the long-term solution. The solution is to think defense in a broad sense in a completely different way from what we do today. Yep.
Yes, we see there's no questions in the chat, so I think if people can just unmute themselves and bring, if you want to go deeper in your questions, Bea, Almudena, or anybody else.
No, I think it means that everything is clear and we can close down. I mean, that's I think all problems have been solved. So, come on, fellows.
I have a question, Jan.
Very good.
Yeah, my name is Bente, and I'm also from DNS. Thank you for your presentation. I got a lot of information that I didn't know. And then I was wanting to ask you to answer your own question.
Oh my God, that's difficult. These are the most difficult questions.
Yeah, you put up some quite difficult questions. But you are asking, how is it that anybody speaking about this militarism, how is it that they are shut down? How is it it's not a public debate? How is it that the environmental issues are much more debated? And I would like that you give us some feedback on that one. So I put the question back to you.
Yeah, that's a very nice little trick, not having your own question, but asking me some questions that I have. Very smart.
Sorry,
very smart.
but
that's okay. Let me say, first of all, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 70s and 80s where, you know, these issues were front page material in the media. and you're experts on it. You in Denmark had a disarmament and security commission, of which I was a member for 10 years as an advisor to the Danish government. We published reports. There was an intellectual input. We were researchers and journalists and others who made papers for the government to reflect on. You had white books, as they were called. Those were alternative defense reports stating how, for instance, Germany should instead defend itself instead of, high-tech long-range weapons and nuclear weapons. We had a whole research endeavor, which was called defensive defense, parts of which I was talking about just a moment ago. And you had media people who were experts, who knew something about peace and security. You even had journalists who had read books. Would you believe it? Now, I don't know what has happened. But first of all, I think the military-industrial media academic complex has managed to squeeze out everyone who had a critical attitude to these things, including myself. I was sitting on Danish and partly Swedish media during many years, several times a week. I was writing articles in the bigger media. I was in international media. I'm not there today. There's nobody in Denmark who would even call me and ask, what do I know about Syria or somewhere else I've been where I happen to know something? So peace is no longer a word used. You can say it's the same with the word solidarity. It's gone. So the intellectual content of this international security thing has been eroded completely. There is also virtually no peace research anymore. It's been co-opted by money, the state-financed institute, which ours is not. State-financed institutes, the deal is we give you money, but you don't do provocative or critical research of our own policies. That's all gone. It's all gone. Third, I think there is one factor, at least for the Nordic countries and partly for Europe, that is that the Social Democratic Party has disappeared. It's still there by name, but it has nothing to do with what was social democracy earlier. We had hugely important international social democratic leaders like Willy Brandt and Olof Palme, Bruno Kreisky, and others who were deeply concerned, also because they were children of the Second World War. They were deeply concerned about avoiding anything like a third World War, so to speak, in Europe again. And you may remember, now you don't remember, you're younger than that, but Olof Palme, shortly before he was killed, chaired a committee on common security. The idea being, as he formulated, we cannot be sure or feel safe and secure in the West if they don't feel secure in the East. We can only find security together. We can be different, we can have different opinions, we can have different weapon systems, we can have all this, but we need to talk with each other so that, for instance, an exercise is not taken on the other side as something that is the beginning of a war. So we overreact and suddenly we have a war that nobody wants. That was the whole thing was built into also what was called the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. That was built in 1975 with the Finnish president Urho Kekkonen. Now, long story short, it was part of ordinary politics to discuss peace, security, disarmament, and get rid of nuclear weapons. So, or make nuclear weapons-free zones, for instance. So I think that the fact that that party has disappeared and much of the anti-militarist idea, which the left used to have, is totally gone too. And the Green Party that came in Germany on a ticket called disarmament, no nuclear weapons, peace, cooperation, dialogue, nonviolent Gandhian thinking, people like Petra Kelly and Gerd Bastian, who so tragically disappeared from it, were spearheading a new politics that led to nuclear weapons being relatively disarmed in Europe and less tension in Europe. All those forces I mentioned now are no longer there. They're no longer there. And that means you can get away with basically everything. May I give you an example? You can now get away with, and with you, I mean the United States, particularly, but also some NATO countries in Europe, getting away with starting a new Cold War, goddammit, on China. So it's a second Cold War, or World War, a wall that we are building now, that they are building now against China. I'm completely against it. It is devastating for themselves. It's devastating for China. It's devastating for the world. These two giants in the international system, one wants cooperation, that's China, but also reserves the right to be Chinese and not Western and do things its way. And the other one wants and thrives from confrontation everywhere. The United States is in confrontation with everyone, everywhere. There's nobody they're happy with. They're unhappy with us not paying enough in Europe. They're unhappy with Russia, very unhappy with Russia. They're very unhappy with China, of course, North Korea. They're unhappy with their own. And that's my final point. Why is this disappearing? Because censorship and self-censorship thrives everywhere. May I give you an example? I want to be concrete because that's the only thing that convinces people, not that I say lofty words. My foundation has just published the most authoritative assessment of the documentation behind the accusation that China is committing a genocide in Xinjiang. It's gone viral on the internet. We've been everywhere on Chinese and non-Western media because we said it does not hold water. I personally sent this report, and as you know, we're totally independent. We're not in anybody's pockets. We just asked ourselves, what is the documentation that China conducts a genocide, which is the most serious accusation you can use against the country. That is to say, they commit genocide. What is the documentation? We find out the documentation is very weak. We find out that the interest behind that documentation is partly the military-industrial complex. Christian fundamentalists, some Muslim Brotherhood stuff, and some pro-Israeli, and some all over only resources and sources that have to do with hating China and wanting interventionism and Cold War with China. So, long story short, we sent that to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 media, Western and non-Western media. And I personally sent this report with a kind diplomatic letter to all the journalists who in CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and other Western media have written for years about the genocide without checking those sources. What is the source of the genocide and the mass murder in Xinjiang? Not one has mentioned the report. Not one of those I personally have written to about this report have written even a thank you very much. That would never have happened in the 90s and into the 2000s. There would have been somebody, some of these people would say, we shall look into your report. It surprises us that we have not learned these things before, or at least thank you very much for sending us this, we disagree with you. That kind of courtesy, decency, and politeness does not exist anymore. And why? Because they all write the same crap. They are all very young people. I'm not against young people, but many of them are not 35. None of them have much of an academic education. They are trained as journalists, meaning they're good at making a story. Anything from traffic accidents to Xinjiang. They have no special competence on China, those who write about it. And they're all called senior correspondents. You know, after 35, you're probably senile. So I'm double senile because I'm 70. You see, that's where we're moving. Long story short, it all happens because the West is going down. The weaker you become, if you don't admit it, then the weaker you become subconsciously, the less you can accept many different views and criticism. So people like me are totally marginalized in the West. And people like me are increasingly admired and used outside the West. I can live with that. I don't think the West can. So I don't know whether that's a long answer to your question, but yeah. It should give you something to reflect on at least.
Thank you. I appreciate and I understand your thinking, and I just hope that it will not take so long time before the West collapses.
Well, I can share that view, but I'm not saying the West collapses. I'm saying the American empire collapses and militarism collapses. I have never been anti-American. I repeat that, I've never been anti-American. I've always been pro-American, the people, the culture, the dynamics and all that, and what it has given the world. I'm against the empire, militarism, interventionism, and all the things that it has degenerated into. And that's very sad. That's very sad. It's very, very sad that the West has no leadership anymore, in spite of the fact that President Biden says we are working again, we're imagining again, and we're leading the world again. You know, it may be the world in Washington or something, a few capitals in Europe. The United States is not leading the world anymore, and it will not in the future either. What I worry about, and that is slightly related to what we're talking about today, militarism and the environment, is how will the empire be dissolved? You know, the Soviet Union had Gorbachev, a very decent moral man who had a vision, something constructive, say the system is, you know, over. We got to create something new. I do not see any leaders in the West at the moment saying we have to create something new. They're just saying we have to arm more to put through our message and our way of living and our economic system and our human rights concepts. There's no ability of the United States anymore to reinvent itself and adapt itself to the new world it's going to live in. That's another sad point. And when you finally, as an old grumpy man, know that you're going to die, you might do some very bad things. You may decide not to go down with a whimper, but go down with a bang. I often have asked people, and myself, again, a question to myself, what would Hitler have done in his bunker in Berlin if he had had access to nuclear weapons when he knew that it was over? I'm not comparing America with Hitler. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying when a system is over and you find out you have lost the game, how do you react in that moment? So the next 10 years will be very difficult for the world. And then if we survive them, there's much hope for a much better world up there after the attempt of one country to dominate the whole world. That will be the last attempt. The Chinese will not build an empire, but that's another long story, which we're going to talk about in another seminar. So I've talked more than enough. Sorry.
Yeah. There's a question from Shelby. Shelby, would you like to do it yourself?
Shelby does not want to talk with us anymore. Did I say something wrong, Shelby?
Okay, but I can just...
No, she's there. I don't know if she can talk.
Okay, but I can read her question because we cannot hear her, but she is online. Would you, Jan, the question was, would you extend the same philosophy of trans-armament in terms of global military budgets into each national police force policy?
Could you take that once again? Would I transfer, or what did you say?
Would you extend the same philosophy on trans-armament in terms of global military budgets into each national police force policy?
Police force.
Yeah.
Well, these are two very different things. I don't think I would, because the police does not command long-range and short-range weapons for national defense. And ideally understood, the national police forces are social institutions of protecting people rather than, national defense of borders and things like that. So spontaneously, if I understand the question correctly, my answer would be no. But I would extend the idea of common defensive defense, military and civilian. I would extend that to be applicable to all countries. Those who will be against it are the big ones who want interventionism and nuclear weapons. They will be against such a thing, but the rest will be for it. And if you say that is such an utopian system, Jan, it's not realistic, I would say look at Switzerland. Switzerland is not an ideal case, but it's a very good case of a country that basically is defensive. And I tell you, there is no one who's ever going to attack Switzerland. And it's not because of the mountains, it's because of Swiss policies. You see, a very good thing to do if you want to be safe in this world is do something constructive and positive for the rest of the world. Switzerland does that. Switzerland is a meeting place. Although for a long time it was not even a member of the United Nations, it was a meeting place for United Nations negotiators from conflict areas, etc. And secondly, it's a center of art. And third, it is the center where all bad people put their black money. Nobody would like to destroy that. So you see, doing good for the world makes you popular, loved, and respected, and therefore much more secure. I mean, these things are so fucking simple, but have been destroyed by people who have studied political science with American textbooks only, and you know, those who sweep from the research world into foreign ministries and defense ministries, who are today's closed dark boxes, who do not get inputs from outside. I could tell you long stories how much I worked with the Swedish government as an expert in the 80s. I haven't been there since then. Again, it's not my problem. I can live without the Swedish government, but the Swedish government cannot live with just getting into NATO. But if you have no independent policy, that's what you do. You sweep into something called NATO, an alliance, or EU, and then you say, we just position ourselves. We don't think for ourselves. Sweden was a much more interesting country 20, 30 years ago than it is today. And Switzerland is still an interesting country because it has always found its own solutions. Bad or good, I'm not saying everything is good in Switzerland. I happen to know it quite well from inside. But I'm saying it's so much more interesting than other European countries. And had they not been thinking, there would have been constant warfare in Switzerland because of its differences, languages, religions, and very tight living on a small area. So study Switzerland, study the Åland Islands between Sweden and Finland, study Costa Rica. Many good cases, particularly smaller countries. Denmark and the Nordic countries could have been part of it, but we lost it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jan. Damir, could you read out your question?
During the Cold War, we heard a lot. There was a big threat of Armageddon, but these days we don't hear that much about an actual threat of a nuclear war. It's not talked about. But I was wondering, what is your opinion about the possibility of nuclear Armageddon in these times?
Well, I tell you, this is bigger, more serious than it has been in the time I've been walking on this earth. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there are now clear doctrines for the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear attack. Earlier in times, the idea was we are ready to use our nuclear weapons if we are attacked by nuclear weapons. You may say the whole thing is a perverse idea, but that was at least making some kind of sense. The American doctrine, and that's the only one as far as I know in the world, has it that even if attacked with conventional weapons or a huge cyber attack or things like that, they will reserve the right to use nuclear weapons on the one who did it. Secondly, there is now a trend towards miniaturization, making nuclear weapons smaller and smaller. Making them smaller means down to the level of something like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The present ones we basically have are many, many times bigger, stronger, and more destructive, so that they can more easily be used in a war zone with what some people might think is a very heavy impact on the place, but not a long-range impact for the whole world. So what it is miniaturization, conventionalization, making it easier to use nuclear weapons if the situation comes up. This is dangerous. It lowers what is called the nuclear threshold. It lowers down the moment, gets the moment closer where some idiot somewhere would say, let's use nuclear weapons. 3, there are lots of analyses and empirical evidence of technical failures, human failures that could have blown the world more or less to hell already. You may not know it, but the Americans lost, I think, 4 smaller nuclear weapons in the early 50s over Greenland. 3 of them were found, but there's still one lying up there that has not been found. There have been lots of drunk people in strategic command centers. There have been people on drugs. There were people like Nixon and Kissinger who were known during the Vietnam War to not always be free of alcohol when they made decisions about that war. We know these things from memoirs and from research institutes. And so, you can think of not only such failures, nobody intended it, it just happened, but you can also think of a madman, somebody who comes to power and say, the game is over. The only thing I really can make an impression on people in the world on is by using nuclear weapons. That proves my statesmanship. And I would say the moral standards of these things, of these people who make decisions today, are way lower than they were earlier. And one reason I've hinted at earlier is the fact that today's leaders around the world, not only in the West, are too young to have a personal impression or trauma or memory from large warfare. I mean, most of those who make war, decide about war politically, never go to the Middle East and see how they ravage the place and get some kind of sense. Some do, a few do, but they are marginalized like the rest of us working for peace. So the thing is that the tragedy and the suffering of warfare is no longer really on the radar of those who make decisions, because they are children of parents who were not necessarily born, or whose only grandparents have any personal memories and experience of warfare. That is an important dimension. And of course, third, and I'm hammering it in again and again, the media do not write about it. If you take the Danish broadcasting system, dr.dk, you will never see anything serious. You will see personal stories. You will see something about food and sports and entertainment and reality shows. You will see something slightly having to do with sex, which is very good. It has nothing to do with public service. It has nothing to do with anything that happens in the world. There might today be a small article about what happens in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine. Things that are never talked about are things that disappear in people's consciousness. But if we bring it up like we do at this seminar here, it may make people think. I'm not trying to frighten or terrorize anybody mentally. I'm just saying, you must be aware that you can be gone tonight and there'll be nothing left. I personally do not belong to those who think that anybody has a right to decide that. Therefore, they should go. They are immoral. They cannot but destroy a lot of people and culture and values and environment. They cannot be used without doing that. In that sense, they are terror weapons. All nuclear weapons are terror weapons. All countries that have nuclear weapons are terrorists, adhering to terrorist philosophy. Why do I say that? Because it defines terrorism to use a weapon or harm people to achieve a political goal, and those people you harm are not military or combatants, They are deliberately civilians. Now, you cannot use even a small nuclear weapon without killing some 100,000 or maybe 5 million people. That's definitely, by any means, a terrorist policy. Whether China has it, Russia has it, French, British, American, Israeli, or whatever, they are all leaderships adhering to terrorist philosophy. In that sense, they have just much bigger weapons than ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever. This is the largest terrorist weapon and nobody talks about it. We talk about this government terrorism, if you will. And then people say, and that's the last thing I should say about these fucking weapons. There are those who say, but they are so terrible that nobody will use them. We have nuclear weapons to deter each other from ever using them. Now, that is nonsense. Intellectually, morally, philosophically, and I've studied it quite a lot when I was, beginning to get into peace research and international politics, because this is a big issue. What do we do with nuclear weapons in the long run? This is nonsense, because if I know that you know about me that I will never, ever, under any circumstance, use my nuclear weapons, then they don't deter. Then you will use them against me, because I have declared that I will ever, never, never, ever have them. And you could say, if I will never, ever have them or use them, why should I then have them? So this is a little bit philosophical, but let me give you the conclusion. Every nuclear weapon on Earth are there to be used if. There are no nuclear weapons anywhere that will never, ever be used, because if I tell you that I will never use it, those I have, then you're not deterred, then you might contemplate using them on me. That means my deterrent consists in saying I'm willing to use nuclear weapons if you do some bad things to me. That means deterrence, and deterrence is terribly dangerous because it only works in peacetime. If there is a situation like the Cuban Missile Crisis, we are this close to destroying the Earth. But my philosophical point is they are not compatible with international law. They are not compatible with military fighting, because you can't use the land you have acquired by using nuclear weapons, and you can't use nuclear weapons on your own territory. Nuclear weapons are only for use on somebody else. And third, they're immoral. No human being, no government, no group of people should ever have the privilege or the right to decide whether humanity with 7 billion people shall survive or not. That was usually up till 1945, when we did not have nuclear weapons. That was something some people would say, it's God who decides. But we were unable to destroy the world as human beings. Now somebody can press a button and we will destroy the world even many times over if the worst goes to the worst. That's why I ended my video also with talking about moral thinking and a new global ethics. That new global ethics does not include the legitimacy of nuclear weapons, of having nuclear weapons. They must go. And back to the media, how many of your media in your own country, or CNN, or anybody else, how many told you that in January this year, we got an internationally decided law through the UN making nuclear weapons illegal? They are illegal. The countries who have them today are criminals or doing illegal things, whatever diplomatic word you would like to say. That has never happened before. Since 45 and up till January this year, they were discussed whether they were legal or not. Now we have a treaty that nuclear weapons shall disappear. I did not see that with any mention in Danish newspapers, online media or whatever, justifying the importance of that world historic decision that the UN passed a resolution saying nuclear weapons must go. And I don't know how many of you watching this here have seen it, that is the case. But it tells you that the media do not tell you anything that goes against the military-industrial complex. Yes.
Thank you, Jan. Damir, I hope your question got answered. Rolf, you sent an email both to me and Jan. I think it's your turn to share about it.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I will just say that around 50 years ago, I was in contact with DNS as a teacher in geography, but we went back. And my question to Jan, whom I have followed through the years, is also motivated historically. Is a question whether the perspective of peace dividend, which was a term around 1990, is useful today. And I will just name the tragedy which happened when one of the best environmentalists had written a book, Making Peace with the Planet. It was published in spring 1990, and as somebody perhaps can remember, in the summer of 1990, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq was used by the American power elite to, as their written sources, stating that they wanted to avoid the shift of the geopolitical center of power to some area around Berlin. So this was the geopolitics to hinder peaceful cooperation between the former Soviet Union and Western Europe. And we have several examples that they had this politics. So the problem was, in this book, Making Peace with the Planet, the author Barry Commoner, I have a little book of him about him here, which is saying Barry Commoner and the Science of Survival. He had in this book a plan to use the peace dividend in order to restructure production in ecological ways in all the world. And he said to this, he added about only a comment that this should happen soon because of the threat of climate change. So this was also clear at this time. So it is a real offensive against humanity that the invasion of Kuwait was used as means for the Americans to invade and in the larger process to destroy several countries and the whole region of Middle East, which they call their central command. It is really their historical offensive that they have drawn the Middle East into the catastrophes which we have seen now. And in all this militarization also have hindered a transformation to both environmentally and socially peaceful world. But my question is, so is this too weak to talk about a peace dividend, because it has never happened? This is,
well,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolf. I'm glad you're bringing up Barry Commoner, because he was one of the pioneers, of course, together with Seymour Melman, who wrote the book Pentagon Capitalism and pointed out and conceptualized the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had talked about. And I think that Barry Commoner was one of those who spearheaded the thinking about a nuclear test ban treaty because of the environmental consequences of exploding or detonating nuclear weapons above ground. So they went underground. And also he was a formidable thinker in political terms. I think he made the mistake of trying to become the president of the United States, but the main thing is he is one of those many who have been whistleblowers, who have been visionaries, who have tried to tell Americans particularly, don't continue doing what you are doing. And of course, being not listened to. Not listened to, perhaps even, I don't know, but, you know, marginalized in terms of influence in Washington. There's lots, and that's why I have never been anti-American. There are lots of good people. There are lots of very good scholars. I work with some of them every day who are American and who've seen all these things much better than I and many others have very early. And they have very little influence on, if any influence at all, on political decision making. There's nobody saying, the last president who did that was Carter and Kennedy. Come in here and let's listen to what you have to say. I want to talk with you because you say something I've not been thinking of myself. Those types of politicians do not exist anymore because none of the politicians are intellectuals. They are apparatchik people in the West. Now, I want to point out a couple of things because the peace dividend was a live concept when the Cold War, the old Cold War, broke down. And the Soviet Union disappeared and the Warsaw Pact disappeared. We were many who said, this is the golden opportunity for the West to disarm and cooperate with the former enemy. I myself was in Washington. I was in Washington too, but I was myself in Moscow, discussing with intellectuals at the MIMO, the International Institute for International Economy, and several other places, even the parliament, talking about this fantastic, those who did not experience it themselves will hardly ever understand it, that fantastic thing that the wall disappeared and we could speak to each other, and the Easterners got the kind of freedom they always had loved to get. And the old, you know, dying system crumbled and disappeared. Now we did, and that's probably where you have the beginning of the end of the US empire today. They did a terrible mistake. Very primitive thinking. Now, if we are two and one is gone, then we can do whatever we please. The interpretation of the Soviet Union's fall was that since it fell, Western capitalism, liberal democracy, and later on neoliberal economy has become the only possible and the winning system, and therefore we promote it everywhere. We can do what we want. We can split up Yugoslavia, we can go in and bomb Serbia and Kosovo, we can do all these things because there's no Soviet Union keeping us back. There's not even a balance anymore, there's only us. Now, Gorbachev had the idea of a common European house and a completely different security system that we all supported, those of us who were intellectuals, because he is 90 now, still alive, still doing good things, still saying good things. He was an intellectual who looked way into the future and said, I have destroyed the old system. Now it's time for us together to do something new. He didn't get anything. He didn't get anything. He didn't even get the economic aid to that transformation of his own economy. He got a few people from Harvard University and others who came in sold out everything, make people shares and things like that. And it all ended up in what the West now calls the oligarchs, in a new class society, if you will. But let's keep to security and peace. What it meant was that the West could now freely do things like Kuwait, as you mentioned, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., and Yugoslavia in the 90s. It meant that there was nobody who could prevent it from doing so. And I always said, if you're really strong and you've been winning, then you have to be humble. If it goes to your head, it will kill you. And one thing I want everybody here who's listening to this discussion today, and have seen the video, to know is this. All important Western leaders communicated either physically, personally, at Gorbachev's dacha outside Moscow, or in writing, that they would not, the West would not take advantage of the fact that the Soviet Union was now on its knees. And I think it was James Baker, the Secretary of State at that time, said, we will not expand NATO 1 inch, which was meant to make the Russians feel that they were not threatened and they would not take advantage of the weakness, of the fact that the whole system had crumbled and fallen apart. Where are we today? Well, Clinton in 1994, whom I consider one of the worst presidents in modern times, and there are many bad ones, but he's probably the worst, started expanding NATO, saying, I don't give a shit of what the former presidents have promised the Russians, we're going to expand NATO. And he started out with the attempt in Tbilisi, Georgia, and then the Baltic states, then the destruction of Yugoslavia, and the end result today is, if I remember correctly, 10 countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact are now NATO members. And that's where you have this limit called Ukraine. You know, in 2014, the West tried to make Ukraine a member of both the EU and NATO. That is the red line for any Russian leader, not for Putin, for any Russian leader. Ukraine can never become a member of NATO. It must be neutral between the two. So the long story short is we have cheated and lied and taken advantage of the Soviet Union's demise. And that was what killed the peace dividend that you brought up. We could have done it differently. And differently, in my mind, would have started out with building a common security system a la Palme, common security, confidence building measures between Eastern and Western Europe and the United States and Canada. Secondly, it would have meant pulling down NATO. Why on earth should there be a NATO when there was no Warsaw Pact? Instead, to find a raison d'etre, a reason to exist, they expanded this and said, we can now do everything. And now they are trying to expand it to the Middle East. Also, there's already a NATO office in Kuwait, which a Danish diplomat, if I remember correctly, has been instrumental in setting up. And it has brought unspeakable misery to Europe, to the United States itself, and to Russia. If we had not reacted this triumphalistically in the West, taken advantage of the socialist communist system falling apart, we could have lived in perfect peace with a huge dividend. We could have scrapped tons of weapons. We could have saved trillions of dollars. And today we have new tension, new Cold War with Russia. If you ask me, it is at least 80% the fault of the West. The West had in its command and had the money and the intellectual resources and the weapons and the policies that could have permitted it to create a new system, both for itself and for Russia and for Europe. We didn't, and we're all paying a price for this today. There is no reason, and there's no way we can survive without a reasonable attitude and cooperative and trust building with the Russians. The Russians are too big. The Russians are too civilized. The Russians have too much resources. And there's no way the West can swallow or marginalize Russia. And it'll be even more impossible with China. China is not West. Russia is West. We kind of understand Russia a little bit, Orthodox and bad Christians, but anyhow, Christians, Western. Add to that that the Chinese are thinking completely differently from the West. So I say, if the West, led by the US, is going to have Cold War with both Russia, China, Iran, and everybody else they don't like at the moment, that's the end of it. It's the end of the world as we know it. And it's the end of the United States and its empire. That's for sure. So that's the story about 30 years later about the peace dividend that we missed, that we exploited, that we ruthlessly threw away to show how great we were and how much we could just manage and dominate and rule the world. All this has to go. All this thinking belongs to the past now. If the West wants to save itself, it gives up all these kinds of arrogant, triumphalistically universalizing and trying to be exceptional, telling other people not to do what it does itself. But I'm not sure there is an intellectual capacity in Western capitals. There certainly isn't in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a few other places that I follow. Yeah, that was a long one, but the peace dividend, I'm really glad you bring it up, and you bring up such an enormously important figure as Barry Commoner. And, you know, we have Daniel Ellsberg, we have many others. Today we have Julian Assange, we have people who've been whistleblowers, and we don't talk about them in the West. Have you noticed how much people talk about this bullshit case, which is basically an invention called Navalny, and Skripal before that, and things like that? Where does the Danish newspapers and the Danish television inform you every day about Julian Assange, Snowden, Mumia, and all the other human rights violations, gross human rights violations that goes on in the Western world? They are not speaking about it because they have orders not to speak about it. Don't believe for a moment in something called free media. It doesn't exist in the West anymore, except those of us who do our own media, do our own information online, homepage. The mainstream media is no way free anymore, if they ever were. Goes back to Operation Mockingbird in the early 50s, which was CIA's plan for influencing media all over the world, but particularly Western media, but also those Western media that operated abroad, such as Radio Asia and Radio Free Europe. They still exist. And finally, on this point, there's one thing you must learn and write down, and I'm saying it now 2 times. S1169. S1169. That is the title or the designation of a law that was passed in the US Congress in April this year for competition with China, which among all the bad things that should be done against China, giving China a negative view, negative stories, they set off $300 million, particularly and only specifically for Western media people to write negative stories about what is called the Belt and Road Initiative, the world's largest civilian cooperation project that China started in 2013, put $1 billion in, $1,000 billion in, and which is now the most exciting project on Earth, because it's going to tie the world together from China all through Asia, the Middle East, etc., up through Europe, down to Africa and to South America. The only ones who do not want to participate is NATO, with one exception, Italy. Now, you're now paying journalists for writing particular stories of a negative character about one country that the US or Washington doesn't like. Now, it is, friends, the end of free media if they ever were free. You cannot trust them anymore. Don't waste your time with them. The problem is that the people in the West believe their media, you know, Danish broadcasting or something like that, or whatever you come from. Everybody in the Soviet Union knew that Pravda was lying. Pravda, which is means truth, But everybody knew that that was not telling you the truth, like the party and Brezhnev and all the others did not tell you the truth about anything. The problem here is still some short time ahead, there will be a majority of people in the West who believe the Western mainstream media and what they read on CNN or BBC or something like that. I only read it to see what the agenda is of the West. I don't read it to understand the issue they write about. I would never dream of quoting BBC as a source of truth in my academic writings.
Jan, we have 15 minutes left, and then we have quite a bunch of questions, and they're also, I think, going towards maybe solutions or ideas. So,
okay, very good. I will make my answer shorter then. I thought there was a lack of questions, but that's fine.
Well, apparently it went viral now. So Sarah and Bori, would you like to present your question?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
We had a question actually concerning when you were talking about global ethics, that we need to build a global ethics and that we need to care for the future generation, that are not born yet. What was the question? Yeah, so our question was how we can teach in the Western world this non-reciprocity concept. The fact that we give something, but that we don't get it back, like, yeah.
Well, sometimes a professor should not lie. He should be truthful and say, I don't know. You know, I don't have an answer to everything. I think it's something that will come through dialogue with younger people who can think differently. And it will also come, I think and hope, when Christianity will not be so influential in politics as it is. We're not aware of it, but it's very much of what we do, the Western world does, is based on Christian thinking, such as missionary. They must become like we are. You come with a sword, you come with a Bible and all that. The moment these things become a little bit less dominant, there will be more people searching. And then it is that I think we should be ready to take up things like, you know, Christian ethics is fine, but it's a neighborhood ethics. We should look into the possibilities of responsibility for the whole globe and look beyond our own state. You know, how do these things happen? Well, they happen over a very long time. It's not something we can have a reform of. There are no important changes that are, you know, this quick. It's education, it's media discussions, it's good books being written, it's paintings being painted, it's all these kinds of things that it dawns upon people that they have slowly but surely to think differently. But I'm presenting it because I believe that this is important to say, and because I believe strongly in the world not consisting only of material objects or economics or statistics or empirical stuff, but that the world consists very much in consequence of how we think. What you think is what you go up to do, whether you're aware of it or not. If you don't think, you don't act. You think something and then you act. And I would like to use imagination and vision as a political tool. I had a dear friend in peace research who was the queen of peace research, academic peace research many years ago, Elisa Bowling. And she said, what people cannot imagine, they will not work for. That's why you have so many peace people who only have no imagination. They only work against existing weapons. They think it's terrible with F-35 or something. Focus on the thinking behind it. Address what kind of thought models, what kinds of ideas does it come from that you have such a fucking thing in the air called F-35? The world's and history's most expensive aircraft, military system ever built. One of these planes cost as much over 30 years to fly and operate and repair as the whole Biden plan for rejuvenation of the American economy. One plane, I said, over 30 years lifetime costs. The priorities are perverse, and before we can get anywhere, we have to think differently. Therefore, spend your evenings and your time together saying, what about? What if? And begin to dream and imagine things. That's my answer to your question. How do we imagine what the future generations need? And when we think we have a sense of what that means, then we begin to back it down and say, so what must we do today to serve those unborn generations? I can't be more concrete now because there's now a long row of questions. So thank you very much.
Good
Thank
question.
you. Thank you.
Xenia, would you like to ask yours? No, no, okay.
No, she wouldn't like to do that. No.
What did you say? Okay, but the next, Julia. And Julia was very happy you mentioned Italy before.
Julia will also not talk with me anymore.
I will talk with you.
Oh, good.
In your video, you said that we should stop talking about human rights and we should start thinking about human duties.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask you if you can explain what do you mean by human duties and give some examples.
Well, thank you very much. We are living in a world in which there's a, since 1948, 10th of December, there's a universal declaration of human rights. That means every human being has a right to certain things, freedom of this and freedom of that, and a right to live and a right to justice and a right to work and a number of economic things that, by the way, the West has never respected and violated on a gross assembly line basis. And then I'm struck by the fact is, who are we to think that you can demand something, that you have a right to something without having a duty? It is this strange idea that there's somebody who is granting us a right, and then I can do afterwards, I can either be happy with that or I can do whatever I please, referring to human rights. Gandhi has said it very clearly, there are no rights without duties. And my problem is also with the human rights concept that it applies only to humans. That's why I'm skeptical to the concept of human rights. It is not only humans who have rights, in my view. The trees, the microorganisms, nature, the environment, all the small worms in the soil or whatever, bacteria even have a right to exist. So the idea of human rights is, first of all, wrong because it's universal or universalized, and I do not believe all cultures have the same perception of what human rights should be. Secondly, non-human beings have rights, in my view, to exist. Somehow you're violating the rights of the trees in the Amazon when you cut them down. And that's where duty comes in. We have a duty to respect the rights of those who don't have a declaration for their rights. We have a duty to preserve nature instead of killing it on a permanent daily basis, as we do with the rainforest, for instance, have done for I don't know how many decades. So that's where duties come in. The duty is to care for those who cannot refer to a convention or international law and who cannot participate in some elections or vote for anything. The trees cannot vote. The small children cannot vote. The unborn cannot vote. It's our duty to take them. It's our duty to take them into considerations when we vote or decide what we're going to do. Now, Denmark is now planning to extend all kinds of motorways for car traffic and truck traffic instead of building trains. I consider that a huge violation of non-human rights and a completely stupid thing. If you look at the situation for car driving and trucks down through Europe, we should long ago have built a solid infrastructure with trains that go between 300 and 600 kilometers an hour. We could be in Southern Europe in 3 hours from Copenhagen. So the long story short is, let's never be satisfied with these conventions and human rights. And for Christ's sake, don't make human rights something you misuse for political purposes. Look, they're violating human rights in Xinjiang, so we better have a Cold War. If you're interested in human rights, you're interested in human beings, not in interventionism or warfare and Cold War. That's a misuse of the concept. And that's what most people do today. And organizations like Amnesty are participating in it. Seen it in Syria, I've seen it in the Xinjiang case. But long story short, duty is to take into consideration, empathize with those who do not have a vote anywhere and who do not have conventions to protect themselves. That's civilization, in my view, that you take into consideration, for instance, the yet unborn, or those who do not like the trees or the flowers or the microorganisms, who do not have a convention to refer to, and who cannot even utter or state that they have rights. It's a little bit philosophical, yes, but again, not more difficult than most people I've talked with about it the last 30 years about it with, do understand it. At least the thinking. The question is again, how the hell do you make politicians and decision makers understand any of this? I don't think that's very easy. And that means that much of what democracy should be about in the future is very simple. We have to do it ourselves. Don't sit and wait for somebody to do it. Whenever you vote for a politician in parliament, you give away your power. Have you ever thought of that? Whenever you vote, you put it in somebody else's hand to do what you want to see done, instead of doing it yourself. You have to do it yourself at least as much as you ask somebody else representing you. How many people do think that they have politicians who actually do represent them anymore in democracies? I don't think so. And that's what we have got to think of. We've got to think of these things ourselves. Set up some courses, read some books, have some study circles about global ethics and duties versus rights.
Yes. Okay. I think we came to the end of our scheduled time. And then there's a few more questions, but I think you touched them during the answers of the last one. So.
I'm okay with 5 more minutes if you have these questions. I don't want anybody to feel that they didn't get through if there's something urgent.
Okay, I think we just need to then find out. Well, I think I would like, because I don't, there are some questions a bit going about, but again to militarism and issues. I would like to bring a bit solutionary or like idea of how to organize governments to be more of that thinking, and also that represent like the people more in the global perspective. We talked about it in the preparation part of this course, where you have mentioned that, well, we as people should be able to choose people who represent us globally and not just locally or nationally, because that's the, I would say, when countries or nationalism formed, it was a lot about internal focus, where now is global. So how do you see we should organize our governments, or root what kind of structures we should have to reach that?
Yeah, I mean, the political sphere of our society is lagging way behind the economic and the military one, because in economics, those who run the economic system, the finance system, the cooperative system, etc., they think globally. They think of where do we put up this production to save some money and lower wages and all that. They don't think of nations as thinking only we have to put up the factory in our own country and things like that. They think multinationally. And the military does the same with intervention capacities and militarizing space and militarizing the oceans and God knows what they are trying to get into. The only ones who don't think beyond the nation states are national politicians in national parliaments. And of course, we cannot have a balanced world if economics and military is running much more, if you will, progressive thinking and global thinking, and political decision-making basically sits in government, in national governments like Folketinget in Denmark at Christiansborg. So the short argument is, if you cannot make very quickly a global democratic system where we together, not as nations or nationalities, but where world together takes decisions about where the world wants to go in the future, you know, an expanded parliamentary-like thing in the United Nations or something like that, then I have been thinking, how do you take steps that bring you closer to such an international decision making where people feel they have an influence. And my idea was that we should not only vote for who should represent us in the parliaments, we should vote for who represents my country in NATO. Who would I vote for to represent me in the European Union? Who would I vote for representing me in the World Bank and the United Nations and all the other places where Denmark is involved? And why should we not also vote for those who become our ambassadors? The ambassadors all over the Danish ambassadors, we could take that as an example. The Danish ambassadors represent me and my country abroad, outside Denmark. Why on earth can I not vote for that person whom I think is better than somebody else? It's obvious to me that we could expand the influence citizens have on international affairs by saying, make interesting campaigns, let people tell us what they want to do. If we're going to have a new ambassador in China, let's see the 3 candidates and let's have an idea who would be the best man or woman to do that job. That is decided, somewhere else that we never can vote for. So that's, a very modest proposal for democratizing international politics, in the sense that those who represent the Danes, I don't see myself a Dane, but I do have a Danish passport, but that's all my relations. But if we could find ways in which each nation, citizens, could influence who represents them in international forums, all the committees of the United Nations, all these kinds of things, then we would have a little bit more democracy that would maybe open up for new types of decision making. I am not for a world government. I am not for a world government. And I'm not saying parliaments is the future or political parties is the future. I don't believe it. But I'm saying we also there need to think completely differently. How do we make decisions? And I used jokingly to say, if you can decide which the best song is in the Eurovision Song Contest, maybe you can also find out who should be the best Danish politicians in European politics by voting, SMSing, whatever. I don't know, modern technology gives us new opportunities. Have you thought of the fact that political parties, as they are sitting in the Danish parliament, about 120 years old? I mean, wouldn't it be possible to think of something more, up to date than something called political parties, where you can never vote on people you really like. You can only vote on those who, through the party machine, have become candidates on a list. There's nothing to do with democracy. You can vote, but you can't choose. In my view, that's not democracy. We have a huge task in front of us in getting the Western societies much more democratic. And we have a lot to learn from other countries, including China, whom you think is a dictatorship, perhaps, which it is not. It's not a dictatorship with a party that is run by 90 million members. Now, I said 90 million members. It's not so easy to have a one-man show in such a setting. Let's learn from others.
Thank you very much, Jan. Jan, if you could give a minute or two, because I see that the participants that are here today are also the ones that were in the last course. So if you could give a minute or two, what will be in the next course about? And the topic was military industrial media academic complex. And you mentioned it also now, but if you could give maybe a minute about it, then people will know what is coming next month. And then with that, I think we'll finish up.
Sure. I would jokingly say next time we should discuss what we did not discuss today. Because I find it really interesting to listen to the questions, which have all been good. I'm not criticizing anything. I really enjoyed it, and I tried to give long and detailed answers to it. But none of you have addressed the issue of how do we build bridges between those who work for the environment, for combating climate change and a balance with nature, and those who work against militarism that is part of the destruction of nature. None of you have addressed the question, how do we make these two movements talk to each other. You know, as I say in the video, I think not even Greta Thunberg, who has moved the world, has ever mentioned the military, and I find that terrible. Well, the military-industrial media academic complex is my concept, something I have developed over the years as an expansion of the old concept that actually the American President Dwight D. Eisenhower presented for the first time in his farewell speech. I always forget whether it was 62 or 61 or whatever, but he said, the military-industrial complex is now so strong in the US that we risk undermining democracy. And since then, it has only been growing. So we are in a very deep problematic situation that those who have never been elected in any public elections are actually those who run the show. They're still very good-hearted, but slightly politically naive people who think it's very important who is the president of the United States. Yeah, of course, there's a difference between Trump or Kennedy and Biden. But behind those figures, there is somebody who runs them. And there were also somebody who managed to kill those who did not fit, such as John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy. So I think that we have lots to talk about. The military-industrial academic MIMAC is the cancer on the global body. And I am convinced that if we do not do something about it, reveal it, make it weaker, let it come out in the light, we will continue to have wars. We will continue to destroy systems and humans and people and culture. And that those who do not have it or have less of it will win in the long run. It is a burden on the Western society and particularly the United States. And I say United States not because I dislike it as society and culture, but because it's the biggest. The United States alone stands for about 40 to 45% of the world's military-industrial complex money, whereas the remaining 192 shares the rest. It's in a class of its own, and that's why it can dominate the world still. It's the only thing by which it can dominate the world. Cannot dominate the world intellectually, morally, culturally, economically, or anything else. It can still dominate the world through its military. Interventionism, base system, nuclear weapons, and all that. That must go. That must go. So I'll talk a little bit about how it's structured and what it does to you next time. And then I hope we can have a discussion about how to convert that into civilian. All these people are not bad people or evil people. What I'm saying is they should just be put to work on something else. I love NATO, but a NATO without weapons, a NATO turned into the world's largest humanitarian transport organization, helping people in natural catastrophes, helping refugees, etc. Just put them to do something else, take the weapons away from them. These organizations are very professional. So yes, there are different ways to think about it. If you don't sit in a ministry or a government, because then you don't think about alternatives.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. This about what you mentioned about climate movement and peace. I think that's a good point for us to take up after this call and DNS teams, and to people find it uncomfortable to combine these things, or suddenly climate change becomes too big because then you have to involve too many things. I think it's a good example that we want things to be simple and don't want to dig too deep. Yeah. So I think it's really good for all participants to put it up, and I think we should discuss it one of the morning assemblies or in the common meeting. Anyway,
sure.
So the next course is in the chat. You can register for it already now. The description is not there, but you can register for the course already for all the participants. And then I would say maybe let's unmute everybody at the same time, and we give a nice clap to finish this off. 3, 2, 1, go.
Thanks for all your good thoughts and questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Thank you so much.
Jan.
May I peace off now?
Yeah, you may please.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, can we go out?
Second.